Hey everybody, I think we're ready to get started. It is so nice to see all of you. I'm Mikkael Sekeres. I'm chair of the Medical Advisory Board of the Aplastic Anemia and MDS International Foundation, along with my co-chair, Dr. Odenicki. It is so amazing to welcome you to the 40th Anniversary Summit from AAMDSIF, Advancing the Science and Treatment of Bone Marrow Failure. I also wanted to acknowledge Brad Wong, who is the new CEO and Executive Director of AAMDSIF. Brad, could you stand up and acknowledge? There he is, way in the back. So nice to have you. Okay, so I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction, then it is going to be my distinct pleasure to hand this off to Dr. Steensma, who's going to give our keynote address. So AAMDS, I call it AAMDS instead of AAMDSIF, my bad, was founded in 1983. This is the same year that the Orphan Drug Act bill for rare diseases was signed into law, and also when parents of a young person with aplastic anemia established the Aplastic Anemia Foundation with the help of physicians from Johns Hopkins. So it made me curious what else was going on in 1983. Thank you, Dr. Gore. That's actually a good timing, Dr. Gore. It took you 56 seconds to say something, which is, I think, a new record. The working for the government is good for you. So what else was going on in 1983? And you may not be surprised to know that David, who's going to give our keynote address, wondered the same thing. So we each put together a slide of what we thought was important in 1983, and we did not collaborate. So we did this as a big mystery to each other to see where we would overlap in identifying important events. Well, this is what I found. It was the maiden voyage of the Space Shuttle Challenger. It was also the year that retroviruses were identified by Luc Montagnier and Bob Gallo as being the cause of HIV/AIDS and published in the same issue of Science. Margaret Thatcher and the Conservative government were reappointed in the UK, and it was also the year that we invaded Grenada, which still poses a threat to us, not, under President Reagan. The #1 song of the year was Every Breath We Take by the Police. Cyclosporin was approved by the FDA, also relevant to bone marrow failure conditions. And the #1 movie of the year was Return of the Jedi. This also spawned what I call my Star Wars Freud theory of marriage, where those of us who were coming of age in 1983, instead of wanting to marry the parent of the opposite gender, as Freud suggested, really wanted to marry Princess Leia, chained to an intergalactic endomorph. Now, marriage was about the farthest thing on the horizon for 2 of the 3 people on the next slide. Now, this was 1983. You can see that of the 3 of us, Dr. Odenicki, this was taken in Nigeria, right? Was the one poised for success. She looks like she is ready to take on the world and just looks amazing. Dr. Steensma is sporting a 3-piece suit with no tie, which was Miami Vice meets Northern New Jersey, right? And I am just a fricking disaster there. And it looks like I'm wearing my bar mitzvah suit, mainly because I'm wearing my bar mitzvah suit in that photo. And you can see the one thing that unites the 3 of us is we all had parents that insisted on purchasing the money-back guarantee if you break them glasses. Where it's like the same style, right? It's amazing. Okay. So moving ahead in time, 1989, the Research Grant Award Program was established with the first grant awarded to the influence of hematopoietic growth factors on hematopoietic stem cells. Grants number 99 and 100 were just awarded, totaling more than $5 million of grants. That is truly remarkable. The Medical Advisory Board was established. The founding members still serving include Doctors Neil Young and Joachim Dieg. So round of applause, I think, for that kind of dedication to patients. Just incredible. 1997, patients and families with PNH were supported, and in the year 2000, AAMDS became AAMDS, its current name. The first patient and family conference was held in Denver, Colorado in 2002. The first international scientific symposium was held here in DC in 2005, and the inaugural March for Marrow was held in Indianapolis in 2009. 2012, the MDS Clinical Research Consortium was formed with support from the Evans Foundation. 2015, the Patient Advisory Committee for Clinical Trials was established. 2017, the first International Bone Marrow Failure Symposium held in Mexico. And 2020, AAMDS, along with a lot of us, went virtual and led the way with COVID-19 seminars for patients with bone marrow failure. This was a big deal. And I remember these phone calls that broke like in real time. We all remember this period, right? Where we were all trying to figure out what we could advise patients so they could protect their health as well as possible, and very quickly got some seminars up trying to help people. And I still remember, I think the first COVID-19 seminar was the most attended in AAMDS history. I think something like over 1,000 people attended it virtually. So here we are today at the 40th anniversary symposium. We have quite a program. I'm really looking forward to it. We'll start with Dr. Steensma giving his keynote address. Then we have a lot of really exciting panel discussions. I just listed the moderators here because not everyone would fit on a slide. The first on aplastic anemia, moderated by Dr. DeZern, then PNH, moderated by Dr. DeCastro, MDS by Dr. Odenicki. We have a reception and poster session afterwards, and then an anniversary dinner honoring scientific leaders in bone marrow failure. Tomorrow, we start the day with a pipeline report at 8 a.m., then at 9, future of clinical trials for bone marrow failure conditions. I'll be moderating that. A session on priorities for future research, moderated by Dr. Grobert, and then closing remarks by Dr. Odenicki. So without further ado, I'd like to congratulate AAMDS for an unbelievable 40 years. And welcome the photograph on the left in that 1983 slide, Dr. Steensma, up for his keynote address. David?
Thank you. Yes, my mother sent the least flattering picture possible from 1983. So this is going to be a lot of fun. If I can have my slides up, I am going to talk not just about what's happened since 1983, in the world of bone marrow failure, since AAMDSIF showed up on the scene and has done such a tremendous job supporting patients and their families, as well as research into the field, a huge milestone with that 100th grant. But I'm going to go back to the sort of dawn of human history and talk about the bone marrow and figuring out exactly what the bone marrow does, because it wasn't really obvious at first. What is this greasy stuff inside bones? It turns out it was incredibly important probably in human evolution because we are not apex predators. Most animals that would have been eaten by a predator, the bones would have been all that was left. But marrow is incredibly nutritious and probably helped support some of our brain growth historically. Hippocrates and Galen both thought that the marrow was the nutritional source for bone. And they also thought that the spinal column was part of the marrow, which is where we get all these myelo prefixes for things like myelopathy with the spinal cord. Aristotle didn't agree. He thought what was inside the marrow, that was just excrement, that was waste product. And so these two ideas went back and forth for a long time. And then along came this ENT pioneer, one of the leaders of otolaryngology, who said, well, what about these ossicles I study in the ear? Because they don't have marrow after infancy, so how do they get rid of their excrement? How do they get their nutrition? Maybe bone marrow does something else. Meanwhile, people started using marrow as a metaphor for warmth, for heat, for the substance of things, like Macbeth speaking to Banquo's ghost, saying, your marrow, your bone is marrowless, your blood is cold. Euripides saying, hey, don't get too deep in love love must not touch the marrow of the soul. You got to maintain a little bit of a degree of removal, otherwise you're going to shipwreck your soul on the rocks. And famously, Thoreau, in the introduction to Walden, said he went to the woods to live deliberately and suck out all the marrow of life, to really get to the deep part of it. So that metaphorically is what marrow has meant. It wasn't until the 1860s that there was any kind of scientific consensus that began to evolve about what marrow actually did biologically. And most of it was because of the work of these two guys, one in Germany, one in Italy. Neumann was the guy who really initiated the stem cell concept. They realized red cells were produced in the marrow. That was new. Bizzocero discovered the platelet. That turned out to be an important thing to discover. And they were doing marrow sections, but all post-mortem and all unstained. So what they could see was actually fairly limited. Then along came Paul Ehrlich in Berlin, who will be really important in a moment as we talk about aplastic anemia. To my knowledge, the only physician ever honored on currency for their work as a doctor rather than subsequently as a dictator of some small nation. Ehrlich came up with the stains that define eosinophils, neutrophils, mast cells, and made some really seminal discoveries. Clearly, his office was not exactly a paragon of neatness there, so his mind, however, was very organized. You really had to understand, though, how blood cells change with disease. And these two French physicians, Hayem, the clinician, Malus has designed a little instrument for actually measuring blood cells so you could count them and find that actually white cells went up in infections and red cells went down in certain diseases. And that turned out to be very important. But it was a very laborious process. So Max Wintrobe, who's famous probably mostly today for his textbook, came up with the hematocrit, which gave an anemia measurement within minutes. Of course, in the 1950s, Wallace Coulter, biomedical engineer, developed the Coulter principle, and this really put hematology off to the races. Until the 1920s, it was very rare to look at the bone marrow in life. It was mostly post-mortem. So a lot of these seminal descriptions of diseases in the 19th and early 20th century were done after the marrow was looked at, after the patient died. But a Soviet Army officer in the 1920s was the first to really start sampling marrow routinely during life. There he is doing some bedside teaching. And it was an Iranian immigrant to Minnesota who came up with the Jamshidi needle that we so commonly use today. But hematology really wasn't a discipline until there was something to do about it. Just like nephrology wasn't a discipline until there was dialysis, and and gastroenterology until there was endoscopy. Until you have an intervention, you can't really be a field. And these were the first treatments for hematologic disease that were really effective, and that was the treatment of pernicious anemia, which won Minot and Murphy and one of their colleagues, George Whipple, a Nobel Prize. So we have these three common canonical bone marrow failure diseases: aplastic anemia, myelodysplastic syndromes, paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria. You can see when they were named, and they're all named wrong, really. I mean, aplastic anemia is a pancytopenia typically. It's not just an anemia. The marrow is often not, frankly, aplastic. It's often hypoplastic. Myelodysplastic syndromes, you don't need dysplasia anymore for the diagnosis if you have the right chromosome abnormality. And we've learned these are neoplasms rather than just syndromes. And then finally, paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria is neither paroxysmal, it's typically chronic, not nocturnal, it's there all the time, although sometimes worsened, as we'll talk about in a second. And hemoglobinuria, it happens, but it's not really a designing feature. So it's like that seagull, more of a parking lot gull in reality. Now, anybody who writes a review article about bone marrow failure syndrome, I've certainly contributed to this, has put a whole bunch of circles overlapping, including different marrow failure diseases, different degrees of overlap. And I want to challenge the next time you write an education report, try to do this with like squares or triangles or something, just for a little variety, because this has become kind of cliche. So let's talk just in turn quickly about PNH, and then about aplastic anemia, and then about MDS. So often people will give this guy, Sir William Gull, who is Queen Victoria's personal physician, and administer her anesthesia for childbirth, actually, which then became very popular. Before that, people believed that because of the curse of Eve, women had to suffer during childbirth. That was part of the natural process. Ridiculous idea, but Gull turned that on its head. Anyway, he described what probably was the first case of PNH. Somebody who had intermittent hematuria, But he really didn't distinguish it from other things it could be that we now know about, paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria, for instance. This guy, really an unsung hero and very far ahead of his time. He looks like your friendly neighborhood butcher, Paul Strubing, and really fell into obscurity after this one paper where he described a Cartwright who had hematuria that was darkest in the morning. He noted the patient's plasma was pinkish, and for whatever reason, the patient periodically had spleen and epigastric pain. He also noticed, and this was really the key observation, that the patient's urine darkened if he had a long nap as well. So it wasn't a circadian thing, it was something to do with sleep. And he had just read a paper about how carbon dioxide levels increase during sleep and the serum becomes more acidic. So he thought, maybe there's something wrong with this patient's red cells that make them more sensitive to acidity. And he actually tried to give the patient both acid to provoke a crisis and bicarbonate to try to relieve it. I mean, really very clever, given how little was known about the pathophysiology of the disease. And it didn't work, probably because he gave too low doses. William Crosby, writing 75 years later, said the fault of Strubing's paper that in one leap it had really gone so far ahead of its contemporaries that the contemporaries were not ready to make that leap, that for something to be successful, that intellectual climate has to be right. Just like our flyer over here in this sort of steampunk illustration, it wasn't the time for helicopters, so he's not going to make much progress there. Thomas Hale Ham was the one who developed the first reliable test for PNH. What Ham realized was that if you acidified serum, it lysed, but if you heat inactivated it, inactivating complement basically, then you didn't get that lysis. And so that became a useful test that was still used well into the late 1980s. A guy from Cleveland was the person who described the alternative pathway of complement, which is so important in PNH. But his contemporaries didn't believe him, and he went to one meeting right here in Maryland in the 1950s, and he was so heavily criticized that he went back, this is very sad, he went back to Cleveland and he took an overdose of barbiturates and killed himself because of the intellectual criticism that he had received. And then a few years later, it became clear that he was right, that there is this alternative pathway of complement. I was scanning the room, Yark. I was not looking at you specifically. But it's just a reminder, I think, to be nice to our colleagues. We can respectfully disagree without, undermining somebody so bad, because everybody's struggling with something. So that was very sad. Some of the earliest transplants were people who had PNH. There was a recent podcast with somebody who got transplanted over 50 years ago and is still doing well. And in one of the early series from Seattle by Don Thomas in the New England Journal of Medicine, a number of PNH patients were represented. Well, I'm not going to go through in any detail all the discoveries that were critical for figuring out the GPI-linked proteins. It's really a fascinating story. We now have several treatments focused on complement, FDA approved, and things that are in late stages of development, really very exciting. So that transplant, as we'll hear about later in the meeting, is not the automatic go-to. Let's shift gears now. Number 2, aplastic anemia. Paul Ehrlich, really a brilliant observation in a 21-year-old woman who presented with just severe anemia and is often said to have been pregnant. She wasn't, based on the original report. I just reread the original report to prepare for this meeting. If you're interested in reading it, I put it on a Substack, an English translation of it, because it's really pretty smart. This patient died, and one thing Ehrlich noted was how small she was and her underdeveloped musculature. So I'm pretty sure she probably actually had Fanconi anemia. She'd had several other siblings that died of unexplained illnesses, so she was 21. It's reasonable age for marrow failure to present. The first time that aplasia term was used was in 1904, when 2 Frenchmen distinguished it from pernicious anemia. And then this other guy, Chaffard, a young guy, got up at the conference and presented his case of aplastic anemia, which actually clearly wasn't aplastic anemia. He hadn't even looked at the patient's marrow. The patient had a 14-centimeter spleen, had saturnine gout multiple times the previous year, was a welder, and so clearly lead poisoning, cirrhotic liver, The patient he was an alcoholic, had been hospitalized multiple times. He was just anemic. And for whatever reason, in the French literature, Chauffard, it was described as the person who coined the term aplastic anemia and described the first case. But it really was Ehrlich and then Véquez and Aubertine who described it. Cabot, who started those New England Journal CPCs, put together a case series, an Osler's textbook from Hopkins in 1908, and that was really what put aplastic anemia on the map, and everybody subsequently has referred to that. It's often said Marie Curie died of aplastic anemia. I've looked at some of the records from her clinicians in Saint-Salomon in the spa where she died on the French-Swiss border, and I think she had myelodysplastic syndrome, honestly. Which makes sense given her, repetitive radiation, both as a radiographer in the First World War, and then subsequently with radium and polonium and things. Her notebooks are still kept in a lead-lined box because they're so radioactive. And people just didn't realize, aplastic anemia clearly did affect many of these young girls in New Jersey who were painting watches, one of which I actually inherited from my great-grandfather. It still glows in the corner at night. It kind of freaks me out. It's 100 and some years later. They were painting the watches with glow-in-the-dark and got a lot of radium and got fuzzy jaw and marrow failure. That's my grandpa's watch, actually. People were really, really careless about radium, the same way they were at the time about like cocaine and opium and such. And I went with my daughter to a spa to Banff, and we saw this old spa that had radium springs that supposedly boosted your bone marrow. And then there's, looks like Eileen Galinsky there handing out a glass of radium-laden water. There were German pills that were tonics that were radium-containing. So lots of people got exposed to this kind of thing. Very famous case of aplastic anemia, which gave rise to this idea of the boy in the bubble. Vincent DeVita, whose oncology textbook perhaps many of you have read, came up with combination chemotherapy for Hodgkin's. His son came down with aplastic anemia. He actually diagnosed it and spent the rest of his life in a room that Dr. DeVita had helped design at the NIH in building number 10. And this and one other boy in the bubble with SCID down in Texas inspired this John Travolta film, The Boy in the Bubble, as well as the Paul Simon song, Boy in the Bubble and the Baby with the Baboon Heart, the lines from that. So his sister Elizabeth has written a very poignant book about this experience, what it was like being a sibling of somebody who was so sick. Bone marrow transplant, just at the same time it was coming along for PNH, was used, and we'll hear about that from Joachim. But there were some patients who didn't engraft but still got better, and that led to the idea, Neil Young and others, of using immunosuppressive therapy for aplastic anemia. It's often said that there was a single horse that gave rise to the whole world supply of anti-lymphocyte globulin for a long period, and that's not quite true. It wasn't just one horse. As you can see from this blood paper from the 1980s, there were several progeny that also were very good antibody responders, but the horse was named Vulcan, and ATG really became a standard therapy. Since 1983, every few years, it seems like there's a new paper from Neil Young and colleagues about improving treatment of aplastic anemia. There was the randomized rabbit trial, there's the addition of eltrombopag, and that has brought us really to where we are today. So let's finish up by talking about MDS then. So MDS probably was included in what for a while was called Di Guglielmo syndrome, named after this Italian investigator in Pavia, who was describing people who had something that looked like leukemia, but the cells were really very strange, dysmorphic, and often it evolved over months to years. There were clearly a lot of people in that series that he described with what we'd now call MDS. 1930s, there was this refractory anemia term that came along that really caused a lot of problems, and the guy, Cornelius Parker Rhodes, I won't go into detail because of time, but he was really a pretty terrible person, but very famous too, got on the front of Time magazine for his work at Memorial Sloan Kettering. He was doing experimentation on Puerto Ricans without consent. Just really, really bad stuff. And he's the one who gave us the refractory anemia term. That took a long time to expunge. Pre-leukemia from Leon Jacobson in Chicago, that was another term that was used for MDS. Meanwhile, there was this parallel acquired sideroblastic anemia by this gentleman in Sweden, and another strand of the MDS history, this association with a recurrent chromosomal abnormality, initially just called a group C chromosome, but later became known as del5q, and we now know a lot about the biology of this. I always think this just illustrates how science works. So 4 years after Mikkael had his bar mitzvah, there was a Nature paper which had 3 patients with MDS who were found to have NRAS mutations. And 3 patients, single mutation, got in Nature. But it was a heroic thing to be able to sequence, and it was, first time a specific somatic gene mutation had been described in a cancer like this. So really, now this is doing 100 genes is, an afternoon's work. So it just shows how far things have come. And as many of us know in this audience and have been involved with this, MDS genetics has just come such a long way. We're going to hear about that from Ellie later in the meeting. We now know of dozens of genes and prognostic import of many. The first MDS classification came along from the FAB group. 1976, they distinguished it from acute leukemia. 1982, they came up with the first separate FAB classification for myelodysplastic syndrome. Of the 7 members of the FAB group, 4 have passed away. 2 long ago stopped publishing, and 1 continues to publish in 2023. John Bennett is just amazing. He just had some more papers just last month, so he's continued to do some terrific work. And this was really important because it gave a conceptual framework for MDS and a common language. There were problems with this classification. I mean, it had 5 diseases, and there were 4 that were kind of alike, RA, RAB, RABT, RAS, and then there was this CMML, and I once made the comparison, it was like the Fab 4 plus Yoko Ono was CMML. It just doesn't fit with the others. And so, yeah. There have been other reclassifications of MDS since. I think, unfortunately, big split in the field last year between supporters of the ironically named International Consensus Classification and the 5th edition of the WHO. Lots of efforts going on to sort that out. We also have had now several iterations of international working group criteria, which are very important for clinical trials. We just had a specific agent for a subtype of MDS approved just this week, ivosidenib for IDH1 mutant, which joins these others up on the top. If I look down at the bottom, and I went through and pulled all of the terminated studies of the last 20 years in MDS, it's like a boulevard of broken dreams. Just so many things that we had a lot of hope for. There were initial preliminary data that looked really good, and then just either in randomized trials didn't work out, or weren't promising. They had activity, but weren't promising enough that a company wasn't going to, take it over the hurdle. I mean, like, the Opsana drug. Well, I'll never understand why they did what they did with that, and probably would have been helpful, but they just didn't develop it the way they were advised. So there's lots of things in there that have been tried, made it into clinicaltrials.gov even, and just haven't moved forward to an approval. And who knows about the ones up on the top there? Still a lot of things that are being tested that we're waiting for randomized trials, like with venetoclax, sabatolimab, et cetera. Time will tell. Hopefully we'll have more medicines to add to this list of approvals soon. A generation which ignores history has no past and no future. If you want to understand today, you have to search yesterday. And Norman Cousins' history is a vast early warning system. So to understand what we're going through now, it's best to really understand our history. With the world events in the last few weeks, it's been amazing how people completely ignorant of history have been tweeting, and they've got the solution for a problem that's thousands of years old. It's important to know your history because history doesn't exactly repeat itself, but it does echo, it does rhyme. So Thank you to the AAMDSIF for all the tremendous things you've done for patients over the last 40 years, for many contributions to these advances that we saw. This was my 1983 slide, and you'll see a lot of overlap, actually, with Mikkael's. I probably put a little bit more sports championships there. It was a good year for local teams. You know, the Redskins and the Orioles won the World Series that year. This was before the wild card round was able to take out teams. And also in pop culture, that was the year of Cabbage Patch Kids and of Pogs and of shoulder pads. So it's really a seminal time. Thanks for your attention. I appreciate you listening to this.